بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب زدني علما
الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وصلى الله وسلم على رسول الله أما بعد. Jazakumullah khairan for your attendance. Nice to see you brothers once again, and nice to have the sisters with us as well, of course. And I also thank the masjid in particular, mashallah, despite being a small masjid, it seems to be one of the very active masajid when it comes to lectures and activities and conferences, and particularly the focus on teaching about scholarship. It's one of the really beautiful things that there is teaching about scholarship from across the world. And that's really important because it attaches people to those who can sometimes be closest to them. All the scholars of Islam are scholars, regardless of where they're from, whether they're from the East, whether they're from the West, from North Africa, from Central Africa, West Africa, from East Africa, all parts of the world, the scholars in Europe, the scholars in the US, the scholars in Australia, all of the ulama are our scholars. But it's always the case that someone finds a special connection to those scholars who they have some sort of association with. And so when someone is born or brought up or originates from, for example, the Indian subcontinent, and they learn about the scholars from the Indian subcontinent, that gives them an additional push. That gives them an additional motivation, an additional drive to study and to learn, and also to continue the path and to continue the message that they had. So today, inshallah ta'ala, the aim is for us to briefly get to know two of the most leading scholars of the past century. And they are not just two leading scholars in relation to one country, which is Algeria, but they are actually two leading scholars in the world at that time. And that's something which scholars from across the world witnessed, particularly the leadership of Shaykh Ibn Badis, who was our first personality, and the vast knowledge and eloquence of Shaykh Muhammad al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi. So these are the two people who we're going to, inshallah, briefly look at their lives, look at their contributions, and look at their role in teaching and spreading Islam and da'wah and in jihad. So, there's a lot of, interesting similarities between these two great scholars. The first is that Shaykh Abdul Hamid Ibn Badis, rahimahullah ta'ala, like we said, one of the scholars of Algeria, considered the leading scholar of reform in Algeria. Not necessarily because he had the most vast knowledge. And this is the interesting thing about Ibn Badis. It was his personality that carried him mainly. He was a person of knowledge, no doubt, and a graduate from Zaytuna. And at that time, a lot of the scholars would go to study in Zaytuna. So a lot of the Algerian scholars would go to Zaytuna in Tunisia to seek knowledge. Why? For many reasons. Number one, because it was a great center of learning. And number two, because they're neighbors. Tunisia and Algeria more or less are considered the same country. And they share borders, of course. So Tunisia is to the east of Algeria. So many scholars would go to study in Tunisia at Jami'at al-Zaytuna at that time, including my granddad, rahimahullah, Shaykh Salih Masoudi, also a graduate from Jami'at al-Zaytuna. So he was a graduate from al-Zaytuna. However, most of his efforts was in teaching and da'wah and being a leader. Al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi, as well as some of the other Algerian scholars who were companions at that time, like Shaykh al-Arabi al-Tabassi and Shaykh al-Mubarak al-Mili and others, arguably they spent more time seeking knowledge. But Ibn Badis was quick to make a move. He was quick to do things. Hence he was considered the sort of leading scholar of reform in this past century, rahimahullah ta'ala. This shows something actually, and that is that sometimes with little knowledge, if that little knowledge is put to practice, and someone is strong about their intent and their desire and their goals, that can take a person very far. Whilst someone could be sitting and learning for 50 years, but when they don't have the passion to teach, the passion to learn, the passion to spread knowledge, the passion to reform and contribute towards positive change, then that 50 years will not have the same impact as only 10 years of someone else who does have those traits. So, Al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi and Ibn Badis, both of them were born in the same year. They were born in the year 1306 Hijri, which is the year 1889. So both of them were born in 1889. Al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi was born, in the eastern part of Algeria, not too far from a city called Stif. And Abdul Hamid ibn Badis was born in Constantine. Right, so we said that Ibn Badis rahimahullah and Al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi rahmatullahi alayhi, both of them were born in the same year, 1889. And Ibn Badis in the year 1910, so when he was around 21 years of age, he decided to go to study at Zaytun in Tunisia. He'd studied previously before that, basic Arabic, basic Qur'an, and so on, like the people of knowledge typically would do. They start off studying the Qur'an and some basic texts of knowledge, and then go on to travel to study. And for anyone who wants to go down the path of traveling to learn and to study, the Imams of Hadith, typically in the past, and even the contemporary scholars, their way was always to start off by learning from the scholars who were local to them. And that's something that Western Muslims particularly forget. Particularly Western Muslims, they belittle this part. So as soon as someone wants to learn a bit and seek some knowledge, first thing that comes to mind, I need to go to Medina University, I need to go to Azhar, I need to go to here. There are people of knowledge in the UK, alhamdulillah. There are people of knowledge in the US, there are people of knowledge in Australia, there are people of knowledge elsewhere in Europe and so on. And so it is useful and important to learn from those scholars and benefit from them, and then afterwards you can go and seek knowledge. Why? Because at least then your initial study becomes initial, you take the basics, and you take the basics under the supervision of someone who's living the same circumstances as you are. So once a person has taken the sort of basics of knowledge, seeking knowledge after that, traveling, studying different people from different backgrounds, different experiences and different specialities, then that gives a person real development. Otherwise, what can happen sometimes, not always, but what can happen sometimes, and it happens a lot, is that someone has zero knowledge of Islam, and maybe they have zero knowledge of the Arabic language, and then they spend all of their life in a particular country. When they return, they've taken knowledge, but they've also taken a certain environment. So they may assume that everything in that environment is the representation of Islam. And then they find that there is a clash between what they're living now and between the 10 years or the 5 years or the 4 years that they spent in another country. Because there's no doubt the realities and the customs and the cultures of Mecca and Kuwait and Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia and Syria are not the same as the ones in London and Birmingham and New York and California. There are major differences. And so that clash can sometimes happen when someone doesn't begin by benefiting from the local scholars. And if someone doesn't get that opportunity, then they should definitely take advantage of the local scholars after they return from studying. Because knowledge is not just information. Knowledge is information applied. Information applied. And that's what fiqh is. Fiqh is knowledge applied. When the application is wrong, or the application isn't there, then that's not beneficial knowledge. In fact, that can be harmful knowledge. And applied knowledge can only be taken from teachers and people who are older and have more experience and so on. Anyhow, Shaykh Ibn Badis, rahimahullah ta'ala, spent a few years in Tunisia, in Zaytuna University. He graduated. And like we said before that, he studied the Qur'an. He actually memorized the Qur'an when he was 13 years of age. So he was quite young, relatively young when he memorized the Qur'an first, and then went on to study at Zaytuna. After 3 years from studying at Zaytuna, and he studied with some of the most senior scholars. Can anyone name a well-known Tunisian scholar of this time who you think may have been one of his teachers? He has a famous book in tafsir called Tahrir wa Tanwir. Shaykh Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur. And Shaykh Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur is not only a great scholar of usul al-fiqh and maqasid al-sharia and fiqh and also tafsir as well as language, but he also lived very long. He lived a long life, close to 100 years. Yeah, he lived around 100 years. And so Abdul-Hamid ibn Badis was one of his students, was one of the students of Shaykh al-Tahir ibn Ashur. Although Ibn Badis passed away 33 years before Ibn Ashur. So Ibn Badis passed away 33 years before his own teacher. Not because Ibn Badis was older, no, but because Tahir ibn Ashur lived a very long life, and Ibn Badis, rahmatullahi alayhi, lived a relatively short life. In fact, he lived half of the life of Tahir ibn Ashur. He passed away around 50 years of age, 51 years of age. And Ibn Ashur passed away at around 100 years of age. So anyhow, after he graduated from Zaytuna, he went to perform Hajj in 1913. Upon performing Hajj, he met some very important figures who would go on to become his closest companions in spreading ilm, spreading knowledge, and they would go on to become some of his closest companions in reforming the Algerian society and also in the jihad against the French occupation. And who did he meet when he was during his performing of Hajj? He met Al-Bashir Al-Ibrahimi, rahimahullah, who's the other person we're talking about today. So Ibn Badis went to perform Hajj in 1913. Al-Ibrahimi had already gone to Hajj. Sorry, he'd gone to Medina. So Al-Bashir Al-Ibrahimi had already gone to Medina to study there, quite early on. Yeah. And Ibn Badis, when he went to perform Hajj, he met with Al-Ibrahim. So they found each other close in age, close in ideas, similar objectives, same country, both Algerians. Yeah? And they had the same objectives. So from then, a very strong, powerful relationship began between these two great giants, Al-Imam Ibn Badis and Al-Imam Al-Bashir Al-Ibrahim. After this short spell in Medina and Mecca, Ibn Badis benefited from some of the ulama there, some of the scholars, and then he was advised. He was actually hoping to stay in Medina. And one of his teachers said to him no. One of his teachers, who was an Indian alim, he said to him, go back to Algeria, because in Algeria they are more in need of you than they are here in Medina. Here we don't need you in Medina, but over there in Algeria they do need you. So he ended up taking with his teacher's advice, and upon his return to Algeria he opened up schools and learning centers. And by the way, we are talking about a time in which Algeria was occupied by the French. So this period that we're talking about, Algeria had been occupied by the French for almost 100 years. About 80 years, the time that we're talking about. So for a very long time, ignorance was spread. The Arabic language was prevented. The study of Islamic sciences was banned. The study of tafsir was prevented. And the French had a somewhat good relationship with some of the Sufis of Algeria, and they didn't have much of a problem with people repeating, having gatherings of dhikr and reciting the Qur'an and memorizing the Qur'an. Because memorizing the Qur'an, if you don't bother understanding anything, it's not going to cause much harm. It just becomes a cultural practice. Oh, we're Muslims, so we have this thing where we read Qur'an and sing it nicely and so on. So that's not so effective, that's not so harmful, it's not so much of a threat. So they didn't have much of a problem teaching people Qur'an, letting people memorize the Qur'an, okay, in gatherings, reciting the Qur'an, okay, circles of dhikr, okay, things like that. There wasn't a big deal with that. But learning the Arabic language, no. Keep them to learning French. Keep them to learning French. And so this was the time that they were in. These two scholars were facing this time. In fact, one of our teachers, who is from Algeria as well, he told me just a few weeks ago that his mother for a long time didn't even know Arabic because French was dominant. This was one of the objectives of the French, was to eradicate Arabic. Because if you eradicate Arabic and detach people from the Arabic language, that means you've cut off the means to understanding the Qur'an and understanding the Sunnah and then acting upon it. And if people start to learn and act upon the Qur'an and the Sunnah, what's going to happen? Submission is to Allah alone. Submission is to Allah alone, not to the will and the desires of those who are occupying or aiming to spread their beliefs and their values and their ideologies in the Muslim lands. So anyhow, my teacher was telling me that his mother didn't have much knowledge of the Arabic language for a long time. When she grew a little bit older, she was learning Arabic. She had a teacher who was teaching her the Arabic language. And he said that she saw her own teacher being killed in front of her eyes. Why? Because how dare he, without permission, teach the Arabic language. So the French were very tough on this issue of Arabic. And this is why Ibn Badis and Ibrahimi, one of their main objectives was to revive the Arabic language in Algeria. And he would famously sing well-known poems and say, شعب الجزائر مسلم وإلى العروبة ينتسب من قال حاد عن أصله أو قال مات فقد كذب. شعب الجزائر مسلم. The nation of Algeria is Muslim. وإلى العروبة ينتسب. And their lineage and their association goes back to the Arabs. So it's an Arab-speaking country. من قال حاد عن أصله أو قال مات فقد كذب. Anyone who says that he's moved away from his origin, or anyone who claims that they've died, the Algerians have died, فقد كذب, then he's lied. Because that's what the French used to say. They used to say there's no such thing as Algeria. This is another part of France. This is the southern part of France. Algeria is the southern part of France, and the European part is the northern part of France. That's what they would say. So one of the main objectives of Ibn Badis and the group of scholars who were with him was to revive the Arabic language. And that's an objective that we shouldn't belittle. Because the association of Islam to the Arabic language isn't one of culture. It's not because it was revealed amongst the Arabs. That's not what we're interested in. But the association of Islam to the Arabic language is because the Qur'an and the Arabic language cannot be disconnected. Arabic and the Qur'an are like this, they go hand in hand. And so if one of them is detached from the other, there's a problem. So Ibn Badis returned from Medina and started to teach in the masjid he started mainly teaching tafsir, started teaching children, and he didn't shy away from teaching children because he knows that this is where reform takes place, when the young generation grows up with correct knowledge. Al-Ibrahimi had a slightly different journey. He also, like we said, was born in the same year. Which year was he born in? 1889. Okay. He's born in 1889. And he also started studying with his father initially, and he started studying with his uncle, who was one of the well-known scholars of Algeria, Shaykh Muhammad Makki al-Ibrahimi. So he studied some Qur'an with him, he studied the Arabic language, he studied some basic sciences, Islamic sciences, and he memorized a lot of poetry. Al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi was a giant when it came to eloquence. A very, very eloquent man. And some of the most eloquent scholars of the past century, considered him to be exceptional in his balagha, in his eloquence. And Shaykh Ali Tantawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, who's a well-known scholar in the Arabic language, and was a Syrian judge, and also an expert in Arabic, he witnessed that Shaykh al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi was exceptional when it came to his Arabic. And so al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi, in 1911, he went to study in Medina. And he spent a few years in Medina, benefited from the scholars there. He studied he studied Maliki fiqh. Algeria, of course, the dominant madhab in Algeria is the madhab of Imam Malik. In fiqh, the dominant madhab of Algeria is the madhab of Imam Malik. In fact, Africa generally, the dominant madhab is the madhab of Imam Malik, the Maliki madhab. So that's Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Mali, Senegal, Nigeria. These countries, Sudan as well, these countries, generally speaking, are Maliki in their madhab. The books taught are the Maliki books of fiqh. The scholars are experts in Maliki fiqh, and so on. So he studied Maliki fiqh with some of the teachers in Medina, and he also studied with the Shaykh Hussein Ahmad al-Faydabadi, who was an Indian scholar, and he studied Sahih Muslim with him. Al-Ibrahimi, like we said, he met with Ibn Badis during Hajj in Medina, and then a strong relationship built. And then Ibrahimi afterwards went to Damascus, and he spent a couple of years there teaching knowledge. He taught at Jami' al-Umawi, a big masjid, a well-known masjid there in Damascus, until afterwards he went back to Algeria. When he saw that Ibn Badis had such a big impact already in teaching knowledge and having classes and circles of ilm, teaching tafsir, teaching hadith, teaching Arabic language and teaching children Qur'an, whilst encouraging them as well to understand and so on, he similarly set up a school. Al-Bashir Ibrahimi set it up in Stif, a city called Stif, just as Al-Ibrahimi set up, just as Ibn Badis set up a school and a learning center in Qasantin. See now, that's the sort of discussion on their biographies, briefly. So we said that the French had occupied Algeria for a long time, since roughly 1830. Since 1830. In 1930, the French were celebrating what? 100 years of their entrance into Algeria. And they made big statements and said, Algeria has been part of France, the Arabic language is gone. And some weak Algerians would say the same thing as well. They would say, Algeria is French, and so on. So Ibn Badis and Al-Ibrahimi and a group of scholars at that time, within the year of celebrating 100 years of entering into Algeria, they set up Jam'iyyat al-Ulama al-Muslimin al-Jazairiyin. So they set up Jam'iyyat al-Ulama, a body of scholars, a body of Algerian scholars. The objective of Jam'iyyat al-Ulama was to have scholars across Algeria taking care of the different parts of Algeria in terms of teaching them knowledge and educating the people. Because, a country that has been dominated for such a long time, imagine people don't know the Arabic language. Algerians at the time, many of them did not speak the Arabic language at all. They just knew French. Learning was in French, communication was in French, official documents and so on in French. And so, ignorance was so widespread, and the little religion and the little Islam that did exist, a lot of it was, polluted with ignorance and innovative practices and, sinful or impermissible or incorrect methods of worship and so on. Add to that corrupt beliefs and so on. So if this is the society that we're talking about, then definitely they had a big job at hand. So this was their aim. And really this should be the aim of all scholars and all senior students of knowledge in every part of the world. There should be, a coming together. People of knowledge should be coming together and supporting one another to take care of different parts of their country. Really we want that here as well in the UK. We want there to be some capable, competent scholars in Cambridge and in the different parts of London, in the West Midlands, up north, in the east, in the west, so that, university students, if they want to learn, if they want to attend classes, people generally, if they want to learn, attend classes, they know that there is a person here. I've gone to study in this city, in that city, I know there's a person of knowledge I can go back to. That's how we keep up raised standards of knowledge. When there's raised standards of knowledge, then society fixes itself. As for trying to fix society and fix the problems of society whilst ignorance is widespread, then that's not going to happen. Anyhow, Ibn Badis, rahimahullah, he taught the Qur'an, like we said, taught tafsir and taught hadith as well. He taught the Muwatta of Malik in hadith, and he taught the tafsir of the Qur'an. He spent 25 years teaching the tafsir of the Qur'an, and he completed his tafsir over the period of 25 years. So it took him 25 years to complete the tafsir of the Qur'an. And this was something common amongst many of the scholars. At this time, especially the scholars who were part of the Jam'iyyah al-Ulama al-Muslimin al-Jazairiyin, they were focused on teaching the Qur'an, tafsir of the Qur'an, the meanings of the Qur'an, and living by the Qur'an. Imagine Shaykh Ibn Badis says, in Tunisia, when I was at Jami'at Zaytuna, we studied tafsir al-Baydawi, and when I graduated, I still didn't know that the Qur'an is a book of Hidayah. Alaykum as-salam wa rahmatullah. I still didn't know that the Qur'an is a book of Hidayah. Yeah? What's he trying to say with that? He's saying that it's almost like we were studying the Qur'an and the tafsir of the Qur'an as a book of information or as a book of blessing, as a book of facts, and so on. So he said, even after studying for so many years under scholars and in an institute like this, I still didn't truly appreciate that this Qur'an is a book of Hidayah. And this is why this is one of the big focuses of the Algerian scholars, the scholars of Jam'iyyat al-Ulama al-Muslimin al-Jazairiyin. They would all teach tafsir. One of our teachers in Algeria, his name is Shaykh Zahed Ibn Badis. He also has the same methodology of teaching tafsir and hadith. And not too long ago, a few years ago, he completed teaching the tafsir, and he lasted 17 years teaching tafsir of the Qur'an. He's taught the tafsir, tens of times, cover to cover. He more or less completes the tafsir of Qur'an with students every single year. And he teaches Sahih Bukhari every single year. And sometimes more than once. And so this was the approach of these scholars. Just teach knowledge. And teaching it through the Qur'an, through the Ahadith, makes people realize, hold on, I didn't know that the Qur'an has such an incredible amount of guidance in it for our day-to-day lives. I didn't know that the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ are so close to us. Sometimes we view the Qur'an and the ahadith of the Prophet something that's, you have to be super special, super religious or super knowledgeable to be able to get near these things. So when these things are being taught in the masajid and spread amongst people, people start to appreciate that actually, this is guidance. This Qur'an is a hidayah. And these sunan of the Prophet ﷺ are a hidayah. Over time, over the years, they opened up many schools, many Islamic schools around Algeria. And like we said, they had different competent scholars. Competent scholars, not just any, person. Not just any person who, has memorized the Qur'an or something and he goes away and takes care of a community. These are competent people. Competent students of knowledge and competent scholars. And they would be sent around to different parts of Algeria. Not necessarily their homeland. Not necessarily their place of choice, but they agreed that some sacrifice has to be involved if we're going to make change. So they would be told, you, Fulan, go here, in this city. So and so, go in this city, so and so, that city. So that, the whole country's standards of ilm, knowledge and the deen is raised. These two scholars, Ibn Badis and Al-Ibrahimi, rahmatullahi alayhima, their reform took place through two main means. The first is through teaching the younger generation and teaching the public in general. In masajid, in schools, okay? So like we said, they would hold classes, they would teach, they would spread knowledge, teach the tafsir, teach ahadith and so on. Ibn Badis, like we said, taught the Qur'an and also taught Muwatta of Malik. And Al-Ibrahimi taught Sahih Muslim and other books of hadith also. So that was the first way, that was the first effort. The first effort was in teaching knowledge directly. Teaching knowledge directly. The second way was to take advantage of the media. At the time, who knows what the most common method of sharing Islamic knowledge was using the media? So we're talking the early 1900s. This was very big in Egypt, big in Algeria, in Tunisia, in the Muslim world, generally speaking, was a particular means used through newspapers and magazines. Newspapers and magazines. So they would write articles, essays, and they're published. And people look forward to them, they're learning new things. Okay? And that was the means at the time. That was the means at the time. Today, it's obviously necessary to take advantage of other means. It could be social media outlets, it could be. And it could be other means as well. So the point is, these were two main things which they focused on. Number one, teaching the community directly in masajid and learning centers. And number two, through making use of the media and writing in magazines and papers and so on. Of course, their magazine was shut down every time. Every time they opened one, the French would shut it down. And then they'd open another one under a different name. And Ibn Badis was fortunate because his father had a good relationship with the French. And he had that good relationship with the French. So when they were so sick and tired of him, of course they've tried to harm him many times. They, even some of the Muslims tried to kill him, because one of the things that he did was to strongly, and by the way, the ulama, these two scholars in particular, were highly critical of a lot of the Sufis of Algeria at that time. For a number of reasons. Number one, because they almost detached people from studying the Qur'an and its meanings and studying the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. They just, lock your mind and blindly follow what the Shaykh says. And secondly, because of their strong relationship with the French. So they saw that these guys were a barrier. They were a barrier to to the Algerians and the Muslims in North Africa overcoming this French occupation. Because they would say things like, this is Allah's decree, and alhamdulillah, we can still memorize the Qur'an. So what's the problem? Just let them take control, let them do everything. And we're praying 5 times a day and we're memorizing the Qur'an, alhamdulillah. These scholars said no. These guys are a barrier to freedom, a barrier to knowledge, a barrier to being enlightened. And so there was a strong battle that took place between them. Not a physical battle, okay, but in terms of writings and things like that. Not because they just hated, Sufis in general. That wasn't the case. But they saw that these, or the Sufism in general was a barrier at that time. And there were some Sufis who were scholars of fiqh and people who, held the Sunnah in high regard, and also they were people of jihad against the disbelievers, against the French at that time. So Ibn Badis was, they attempted to harm him many times and even attempted to kill him. And so when the French went to his father and said, look, we're sick and tired of this guy, speak to your son, otherwise we're going to cause a problem. So he spoke to his son, and Ibn Badis had an exceptional amount of respect for his father and would obey him in everything. So when his father spoke to him, he said, look, these guys are telling me this and that. He said to his father, look, I will listen to you in anything. I will obey you in anything. Anything. Except the Jam'iyyah. Except Jam'iyyat Ulama Muslimin. That isn't a matter that I own. I don't have ownership of this. That's something for the Muslims. And so therefore, if you want me to change that, then I can't do anything about that, unfortunately. So his dad said to him, Khalas, do what you think, and I'm pleased with you. So it seemed like his father, he only kept that relationship with the French, perhaps in order to act maybe as a sort of bridge for the Algerians and to sort of benefit the Algerians, not because he genuinely wanted to support the French at that time. Anyhow, there's a lot to say really, and these two scholars spent so many years teaching the community, teaching the young generation. After decades of this teaching, they were prepared to take on in battle. They were prepared to give their lives and come face to face with the French. And then when this battle against the French, the battle for independence took place against the French and continued for a number of years. Eventually, in 1962, they gained their official independence. Yeah, and I say official independence because we can't really consider something independence until people's minds are completely detached from disbelief and detached from values of disbelief like secularism and any other types of values that contradict Islamic teachings, until people are fully firm about why they're Muslim and about the importance of Islam, following the teachings of Islam and living by Islam. When that fully happens, you have state and public, then we can say that's complete independence. Until then, it is, you could say, partial independence. And this is why, even after this independence occurred, still al-Bashir al-Ibrahimi was being critical of the affairs in Algeria. He wasn't happy with a lot of what was going on in Algeria. And so they harmed him. Despite being such a great scholar and a great leader, he was harmed, he was hurt, and he was sort of kicked out of his home. Rahmatullahi alayhi. See, how long do we have, Shaykh Ali?
No, carry on. We'll do that later.
See, when it comes to the influences of Shaykh Ibn Badis and Shaykh Ibrahimi, they were influenced by many scholars. And of course, anytime you benefit from someone, those who want to criticize you will associate you to that person to belittle you. So they will label you. And this is really one of the diseases of the Muslim community, labels. instead of arguing concepts and looking at knowledge, we're so focused on labels. And even if those labels are incorrect, we'll still use that label just to belittle people. Yeah? We'll just use that label anyway to belittle people and mock people, and I can't be bothered to argue, or maybe I'm too ignorant to argue. Let me just throw a couple of labels at you. Assalamu alaikum. Okay? Make people scared of you, make people annoyed at you, make people run away from you. So Ibn Badis and Ibrahimi and ulama al-Jam'iyyah generally, initially they were called Abdawis. Abdawis. After who? Anyone? One of the leading scholars of Egypt at the time. He was a Shaykh Muhammad Abdu, rahimahullah. So, these scholars, they respected Shaykh Muhammad Abdu for a number of reasons. Although they disagreed with him in other areas. And, they respected his desire to reform education. They respected his desire to bring people back to learning the Qur'an. They respected his will to take people away from innovations in the religion and believing in, khurafat and superstitions and things like that. They were with him on those things. Although they disagreed with him in some of his positions that related to some of the masail of creed, for instance. Maybe things like some of the matters that relate to the Dajjal or jinn or things like that. Or Nusul Isa alayhi salam. They didn't accept his opinions on that. Similar to Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida. Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida, he is the student of Shaykh Muhammad Abdu. Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida is the closest student to Shaykh Muhammad Abdu. And Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida had a big impact on many of the Islamic movements. So he had a big impact on the Salafi da'wah at his time. And Shaykh Nasruddin al-Albani, rahimahullah, was initially very much impacted by Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida and his, Majallat al-Manar. And he had a big impact on Al-Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, Al-Ustad Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, rahimahullah, he initially was given the responsibility of taking over Majallat al-Manar and continuing to write articles and essays and so on at this Majallah. So he was impacted by Muhammad Rashid Rida as well, and that madrasa, generally speaking, Muhammad Abdu and so on. And the Algerian scholars, Jami'at Ulama al-Muslimin Jazairiyin, were also influenced by Shaykh Muhammad Abdu and Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida to an extent. To a large extent, in fact, and they highly respected them. And one of the great Algerian scholars, who's Shaykh al-Arabi Tbissi, who was killed, in fact, he was burnt to death by the Algerians. And when they saw that he had such a stable stance, he would even say that teach your children from a young age that hating France is part of Iman. Not because of France, the country, but because of what they represented at that time. That's kufr and hatred for Islam. So when they saw his strong stance, they, hung him up and slowly lowered him into burning oil. So when when he was in that position, they gave him an opportunity to go back on what he said, to go back on his actions and so on and so forth, and he would just ignore them and say, La ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah. And as soon as they put his feet into this burning oil, he fell unconscious immediately, and they threw the rest of him into that. That's how he passed away, rahimahullah ta'ala. May Allah accept him as a shaheed. So this person, Shaykh al-Arabi Tbissi, rahimahullah, he was a serious personality, really strong character, and a very, very knowledgeable person, maybe one of the most knowledgeable scholars, maybe you could even say more knowledgeable than Ibn Badis and so on. Because Ibn Badis, like we said, what made him was his strong character. One of our teachers says to us, one of the Algerian mashayikh, he says, I believe Ibrahimi and Tbissi are more knowledgeable than Ibn Badis. But the way that they treated Ibn Badis was incredible. Because Ibn Badis was a person of strong iman, so certain of his iman, so certain of his knowledge. This is what we said at the beginning. We want people who have ilm, real ilm, and then are strong when it comes to applying them. That's for 60 years, studying the books and so on, and then, no impact. Then that benefit is almost like an individual benefit. It's almost like dhikr. It's almost like dhikr. The person who's in a masjid just making dhikr. That's a nafa' khas. It's the benefit just for that individual. So anyways, a lot of these Algerian scholars were impacted by Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida and the Shaykh Muhammad Abdu. They were also impacted by the Salafi da'wah in Najd. The Salafi da'wah in Najd, and that's the movement of, the school of Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, rahimahullah, and his followers. So they were, they benefited from some of their works and so on, but they were not part of that movement. They were not people who said everything these scholars say of Najd we have to say. In fact, Bashir Ibrahimi says, Ibn Badis, in fact before him, he says, these guys, they'd be calling us Wahhabi. So in the beginning they called them Abdawi, and then after they called them Wahhabi as well. Even though there's differences between Shaykh Muhammad Abdu and Shaykh Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, many differences in terms of their views and so on. So they said, I only know very little about Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab anyway. And I have never bought any of his books. But still they use that label, just because there is some similarity in some of the objectives and approach, when it comes to da'wah, when it comes to reform, when it comes to spreading knowledge. طيب. And that sort of goes to show that these were people of knowledge who made ijtihad, and they tried their best to make positive change. They tried their best to raise the status of the Qur'an and the prophetic sunnah in people's hearts, and they tried to purify people's iman, people's creed. They tried to purify and keep it firm, strong, beautiful, the way it was revealed, not have it mixed, with other false ideologies and false beliefs and so on. This was their objective. No, it doesn't mean every single word that someone says is correct. It doesn't mean that every single word that these Algerian scholars say is infallible, or what Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab says is infallible. That's extremism. That's extremism. To think that knowledge is restricted, to just one view or one country or one alim, and that criticizing that person is unacceptable. So that's over the top. Yeah, and this is why, as you saw, Ibrahimi and the other scholars, they benefited from ulama who had different backgrounds. The ulama of Zaytuna, for example, they were Maliki Ash'ari in their creed. He benefited from them. The Shaykh Muhammad Abdu, Shaykh Muhammad Rashid Rida, you could say they had Salafi inclination when it came to many things, and maybe they were aqlani when it came to some matters of creed and so on, and so he benefited from them. They benefited from Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, also a different movement, a different approach. So they benefited from all these scholars. They didn't have to attack them. In fact, they considered them their brothers. They considered them where we've got similar goals, similar objectives. The overall aims are the same. And Bismillah, where there is mistakes, we'll correct them, no problem. Even if it means writing an essay, writing a paper, writing some research to show that what this alim said is wrong, there's no problem. There's no issue in that, whatsoever. طيب. Shaykh Ibrahim rahimahullah says, we're going to ignore these labels. If people want to label us like this, we're going to ignore these labels. And he says, we are Malikis just as these guys are Hanbalis. So he says, we're Malikis just as these guys are Hanbalis. However, just because we both call to taking people away from misguidance and so on, they've put us under the same label. طيب. And by the way, I just want to add something additional, if I have time to do so. And that is that when it comes to the fiqhi madhahib, and that is either the Maliki madhab or the Hanbali madhab, these are the two madhahib that we're talking about now, as well as the Shafi'i and the Hanafi madhab, there has never been one approach of the ulama of the four madhahib when it comes to how to benefit and make use of the four madhahib. And this is why the ulama of the Jam'iyyah, even though they were Maliki, generally speaking, but they really strongly emphasized ahadith, Qur'an and ahadith. They really emphasized studying tafsir and studying the books of hadith like the Muwatta of Malik. And they criticized and disagreed with some of the opinions, that were considered mashhur opinions in the Maliki madhab. And that didn't take them away from being Maliki. That didn't take them away from generally being upon the same school, the legal school of Malik. The same is to be said about the ulama of Najd. The same is to be said about the ulama of Najd. You don't take someone away and kick them out of a fiqhi madhab just because you don't like their approach. Some people now, they don't like the Salafi da'wah in Najd, and so you consider these guys are not part of the Hanbali madhab. And some of them go as far as saying they're not part of Ahl Sunnah at all. No. There are some big scholars of Najd who were Hanbali. In the fiqh, they were Hanbalis. Like Shaykh Abdullah Ababtain, like Shaykh Abdullah Al-Angari, who has a Hashi on the Rawd al-Murbi', like Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Qasim, like Shaykh Muhammad ibn Ibrahim, the Mufti of Saudi Arabia before Shaykh Ibn Baz, rahimahullah, and one of the teachers of Ibn Baz. Also, one of the senior Hanbali scholars of Najd is Shaykh Abdul Rahman ibn Nasir al-Sa'di, and this guy is a faqih in the Hanbali madhab. Also, Shaykh Muhammad ibn Salih ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, is a big faqih in the Hanbali madhab. And Shaykh al-Hanabila, Shaykh Abdullah ibn Aqil, who passed away not too long ago, who lived a very long life, who was the Shaykh of many of our teachers, rahimahullah. He is also considered one of the senior Hanbali scholars. So now, just because someone disagrees on certain issues, you kick them out. The intention of kicking them out of the madhab is to say, look, they're not from Ahl Sunnah, they're not upon scholarship, they're not upon, which is problematic. So the madhahib, the four madhahib, definitely they've played a great service in Islam, and there is variety within the schools. And so the approaches can differ, the views can differ within the schools. From the Hanabila, for example, you had some Hanbalis who were part of Sufi turuq. Shaykh Muhammad Khalwati, Shaykh Abraham al-Ba'li, and the other scholars, they were part of Sufi turuq. And some of them were part of Sufi turuq and Salafi in Aqidah, Athari in Aqidah. And some of them were, generally speaking, Hanbali or Salafi or Athari in Aqidah, and were not so fond of the Sufi turuq. So the variety in the madhahib, really existed. I've spoken a lot and I've said a lot, and I really encourage people to, as much as possible, read the biographies of scholars. And Jazakallah khair. Shaykh Ali is one of the people who I'm really happy that he puts so much emphasis on learning about the biographies of scholars, particularly the biographies of the scholars of Hadith in the subcontinent and so on. And so it's nice to have some, taste from North Africa now. You've probably heard a lot about Indian scholars. Alhamdulillah, we have some African scholarship now. Shaykh Abu Osama as well is going to talk about maybe some more things as well. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum.